Harlem did not expect the night to turn into a lesson. It began like many others in those years: crowded sidewalks, loud laughter spilling from doorways, the uneasy balance of black life surviving under white authority. People were used to tension. They were used to insults, dressed up as jokes. What they were not used to was humiliation done so openly that the whole neighborhood was forced to witness it. His sister stepped into the street just after dusk. She wasn't running. She wasn't screaming. She walked the way people walk when their dignity has been shaken but not destroyed, shoulders stiff, eyes forward, pretending the world hadn't just touched her in a way it never had the right to. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. One shoe scraped the pavement, as if she hadn't noticed it slipping. The mark on her arm was already forming, fingers pressed hard enough to leave proof. That mark mattered, because accidents do not leave fingerprints. People saw her before she reached the corner. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman gasped and covered her mouth. A man took one step forward and then froze. Because fear is fast in Harlem, and courage is always measured against consequences. Everyone understood what had happened without needing an explanation. A racist gang had done it, publicly, on purpose, and they had done it where everyone could see. That was the message. They wanted the neighborhood to know there were limits. They wanted black families to remember their place. And they believed no one young enough, poor enough, or powerless enough would dare answer back. They had not accounted for her brother. At 19 years old, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not yet a legend. He was not feared. He did not control streets or men or money. He was just a tall, sharp-eyed boy with a reputation for being quiet and thinking too long before he moved. People underestimated him because they mistook silence for softness. They always did. He was inside when she came home. The door closed behind her with a sound that carried more weight than a slam ever could. She didn't cry right away. That came later. First came the stillness, the kind that fills a room and presses on the chest. Bumpy looked up and saw the sleeve, the shoe, the way her hands shook as if her body hadn't caught up with what had just happened. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't need to. In Harlem, racist violence had a familiar shape. It wore the same confidence every time. Men who moved in groups, men who laughed too loudly, men who touched because they believed nothing would happen to them afterward, men who relied on silence as protection. Bumpy walked closer and studied the mark on her arm. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. His breathing stayed steady, which frightened her more than anger would have. Because anger passes, stillness means something has locked into place. She tried to speak. Her voice broke before words could form. When she finally managed to explain, the story came out in pieces. The gang had cornered her near the storefronts. They blocked the sidewalk. They joked. They grabbed. They called her names meant to shrink her in front of strangers. When she resisted, they laughed harder. They wanted witnesses. They wanted Harlem to watch. And Harlem did. Bumpy felt something change inside him that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with clarity. In that moment, childhood ended. Not gradually. Completely. He understood something most boys his age did not yet grasp. If humiliation went unanswered, it became permission, and permission spread faster than fear. It was the sound of men who thought they were safe. Men who believed a 19-year-old black boy could do nothing but swallow what had been done to his family. Men who thought Harlem's silence meant surrender. Bumpy stopped just far enough away for the moment to stretch. He didn't flinch when they mocked him. He didn't lower his eyes. He stood there long enough for them to feel uncomfortable without understanding why. Long enough for witnesses to gather again. Long enough for the same street that had watched his sister be humiliated to now watch him decide something irreversible. This was not about revenge yet. This was about response. People sensed it. The air tightened. The same neighbors who had frozen earlier now leaned forward slightly, as if pulled by instinct. They didn't know what Bumpy would do. They only knew that whatever happened next would matter. Because if he failed, Harlem would learn a cruel lesson. And if he succeeded, the lesson would be something else entirely. Bumpy's hands stayed relaxed at his sides. His face showed no panic, only focus. He had already understood the rules of the world he lived in. There would be no help, no police protection, no sympathy from authority. Whatever answer came would have to come from him, and it would have to come fast, because humiliation doesn't wait politely to be corrected. It grows. As the gang continued laughing, unaware of how close they were to crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, one truth settled into the street like a held breath. By the end of the night, Harlem would no longer see Bumpy Johnson as a boy. Within hours, the same block that watched his sister be humiliated would witness something no one expected, a response so immediate and so final that the racist gang would spend the rest of their lives remembering the mistake they made that night. The street did not explode the way people expected. There was no sudden chaos, no reckless charge, no moment where a 19-year-old boy threw himself at a group of men twice his size and disappeared into violence. That expectation hung in the air for a few seconds, and then it collapsed. Because Bumpy did not act like a boy. He stood there, facing the same men who had laughed while his sister was humiliated, and he did something that confused them first. He waited. Not long, just long enough. Long enough for their laughter to thin out. Long enough for curiosity to replace confidence. Long enough for the street to lean in again, sensing that the moment had not passed, it had only shifted shape. That waiting was the first answer. He was taking responsibility. The gang misread it. One of them stepped forward, too confident, too close, carrying the arrogance of someone who had never been answered before. He smirked, expecting Bumpy to flinch or swing. Bumpy did neither. He took one step back instead, subtle and controlled, changing the distance, changing the rhythm of the moment. That single step did more than any punch could have. It forced the man to adjust, to think, to realize he was no longer dictating the encounter. Power is fragile like that. It lives in who sets the pace. And suddenly, the pace belonged to a 19-year-old who had decided that humiliation would not be the final word of the night. Bumpy turned slightly, not away from them, but toward the street, toward the witnesses, toward Harlem. That movement told everyone something without saying it out loud. Whatever happened next would not be hidden. The same openness the gang had used to shame his sister would now trap them in consequence. The men felt it then, not fear yet. Awareness. They were no longer just a group in control of the moment. They were a group on display. One of them laughed again, louder this time, trying to drag the night back to where it had been. The laugh sounded wrong, forced, empty. It didn't land. Nobody joined in. The street had stopped giving them energy, and without it, they were just men standing under bad light, with too many eyes watching. Bumpy did not need weapons. He did not need backup. He had already found the leverage the gang had ignored. Witnesses, memory, time. The same tools used against his sister were now being turned, carefully, back toward the men who thought they were untouchable. Behind him, the gang stood uncertain for the first time all night. They hadn't won. They hadn't been challenged in the way they expected. They had been repositioned, reduced from actors to spectators. That reversal unsettled them deeply. Bumpy did not look back, because the real response was no longer about the street. It was about what would happen next, about how fast a lesson could travel, about whether humiliation could be reversed before it hardened into permission. Within the hour, Harlem would begin to understand that this was not a boy reacting emotionally. This was a young man executing something precise, something that would not rely on luck or strength, but on timing, and timing was on his side. As Bumpy disappeared into the neighborhood, the same people who had witnessed his sister's humiliation felt a shift inside themselves. Not relief, anticipation, the kind that comes when you sense the balance is about to change but don't yet know how. The gang, still standing under the lights, felt it too, only from the other side. They had expected anger. They had expected fear. They had expected silence. What they got instead was a pause. And pauses, in Harlem, are where consequences begin. Before sunrise, Bumpy's quiet movement would turn into a chain reaction, one that would trap the gang, not with fists or weapons, but with something far more terrifying, a neighborhood that suddenly remembered who it was. The night did not cool after Bumpy walked away. It tightened. What followed wasn't loud enough to wake the city, but it was clear enough to wake Harlem. People talked without talking. Doors opened and closed with purpose. Faces that usually stayed neutral began to show memory. The same block that had watched a young woman be humiliated now carried a different energy, one that said the moment had not been buried, only delayed. The gang felt the change first as inconvenience. A corner that usually welcomed them felt colder. A store that once laughed along now answered short. A familiar place to lean suddenly seemed occupied. These weren't acts of defiance. They were acts of alignment. And alignment is what turns a neighborhood into a force. Bumpy kept moving through it all, unseen but present. He didn't rally people. He didn't warn anyone. He let the truth do the work for him. The truth was simple. Humiliation had happened in public. And the answer would be public too, just not in the way anyone expected. As the hours passed, the gang began to separate. Not intentionally, instinctively. Men who rely on numbers feel strongest when the numbers are close. When those numbers drift, even slightly, fear finds room to breathe. One went home early. Another took a different route. A third lingered, unsure whether staying together still meant safety. Harlem noticed that too. People stayed awake longer than usual. Not out of excitement, out of attention. The night had trained them to read signs, and the signs were everywhere. The gang's confidence had evaporated. Their laughter had been replaced by checking shadows. Their ownership of the street had been replaced by hesitation. Bumpy understood why. The street had chosen to remember. Memory is dangerous because it spreads without permission. It doesn't need leaders. It doesn't need announcements. It lives in shared looks and unspoken agreement. Once memory moves, it redraws lines quietly, making some paths easier and others impossible. By the time the sky began to lighten, the gang realized they were being watched in a way they weren't used to. Not stared at, assessed. Neighbors didn't glare. They simply observed, the way people observe weather before deciding whether to leave the house. That kind of attention strips men of performance. There is no audience to dominate when the audience refuses to react. The gang tried to laugh it off again. It failed. Laughter needs permission too. Bumpy returned home briefly as dawn broke. His sister slept fitfully, exhaustion finally overtaking shock. He watched her breathe and understood something that would guide him from that day forward. Protection didn't mean rage. It meant prevention. It meant making sure the same thing could not happen again. Not just to her, but to anyone who shared the street. He left again before the city fully woke. Morning revealed what night had set in motion. The gang attempted to move like nothing had changed. But the rhythm was gone. Their presence no longer bent the block around them. People didn't step aside. They didn't rush to please. They didn't pretend not to notice. Normalcy, when withdrawn, becomes a message. One of the men snapped at a passerby. The response wasn't fear. It was indifference. Indifference cut deeper. Fear feeds power. Indifference starves it. Bumpy watched the reactions accumulate. He watched how quickly small refusals stacked into obstacles. No shouting, no confrontation, just friction. Enough friction to slow movement, enough to force mistakes. The gang made their first real mistake before noon. They confronted someone who didn't need to be confronted. Someone whose only mistake was standing their ground calmly. The moment drew attention, not chaos attention. Witnesses gathered without clustering. Eyes followed without judgment. The gang realized too late that confrontation now worked against them. They retreated. That retreat mattered. It told Harlem the balance had shifted. It told Bumpy that the street was ready to hold its line. He didn't celebrate it. He measured it. Because moments like this are fragile. Push too hard and the system reacts. Move too slowly and the lesson fades. He chose precision. Information moved faster than feet. Names, patterns, habits. The gang's usual routes became known. Their comfort zones mapped. Not for attack, for avoidance. Avoidance is powerful because it isolates without provocation. The men felt it as shrinking space. Fewer places to stand. Fewer places to belong. By afternoon, the gang was no longer moving together. That was the final confirmation. Groups fragment when trust cracks. Each man begins calculating his own risk. Once that happens, the group loses its shield. Harlem didn't cheer. It didn't announce victory. It simply adjusted again, the way it always had to survive. The street had answered the humiliation not with fists, but with refusal. Refusal to play along. Refusal to forget. Refusal to grant comfort to men who believed shame would protect them. Bumpy stayed quiet through it all. His silence did not mean passivity. It meant control. He let the street do what it had already decided to do. He understood that real power looks like restraint because restraint forces others to reveal themselves. As the sun set on the second day, the gang understood something they had never been taught to consider. They were no longer welcome. Not threatened. Not hunted. Unwelcome. And unwelcome places are dangerous because there is no rule book for how to regain entry. Bumpy stood at the edge of the block as night returned, watching the same street where it had begun. He knew the hardest part was still ahead, the moment when pressure forces a choice. When someone tries to reclaim dominance the old way, that attempt would come, and when it did, the answer would not be delayed. The gang would try one last move to reassert control, and in doing so, they would give Bumpy the opening he had been waiting for since the night his sister walked home in silence. The gang could not live with what had happened to them. Not the humiliation they caused, but the one they now felt. Men like them were raised on a simple belief. Fear travels in one direction. You give it, others carry it. But Harlem had reversed that current without ever raising its voice. And reversal is unbearable to men who rely on dominance to feel real. So, they decided to take the street back. It didn't start dramatically. It never does. It started with presence. The gang returned together just before nightfall, louder than they had been all day, forcing their way into the block as if volume alone could rewind time. Their laughter was exaggerated, their movements aggressive. They wanted witnesses again. They wanted to erase the memory of hesitation by overriding it with intimidation. Harlem felt it instantly. Windows that had been open slid shut. Conversations stopped. People slowed instead of scattering. That detail mattered. Fear scatters, awareness holds. The street didn't empty this time. It watched. The gang mistook that watching for challenge. Bumpy saw everything. He was not in front. He was not hidden either. He stood where he could see the whole shape of the block, the exits, the corners, the places people gathered when they needed safety without calling it that. His face did not change, but something inside him settled. This was the moment he had waited for. The gang escalated because they had no choice. Silence had stripped them. Refusal had isolated them. Now they needed a reaction to survive. They needed Harlem to flinch again so they could feel whole. Harlem didn't flinch. That was when the emotional weight of the night shifted completely. A woman stepped into view with her child close to her side and didn't retreat. A shop owner stayed in his doorway instead of locking it. A group of men stood near the corner, not forming a wall, just existing together. No words, no threats, just presence. The gang slowed. They felt it then, the truth they had been avoiding since the night before. This street no longer belonged to fear, it belonged to memory, and memory is not something you can shove or shout away. One of them cursed loudly, trying to crack the stillness. The sound echoed wrong, too sharp, too alone. He realized something terrifying in that moment. If something happened now, there would be witnesses who would not look away. Not out of defiance, but out of decision. Bumpy stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to be seen. He didn't confront them as a boy defending his pride. He confronted them as a boundary, as the line that had been crossed and could not be uncrossed again. His calm was heavier than anger would have been. It told them he was not reacting to this moment. He was completing something that had already begun. The gang recognized it too late. Their attempt to reclaim control had exposed them completely. They had revealed who needed chaos and who did not. They had shown Harlem that their confidence depended on reaction, and Harlem had denied them that fuel. The pressure broke unevenly. One man stepped back. Another looked away. A third hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. That hesitation was the end. Once a group fractures emotionally, it is finished even if it still stands together physically. Harlem didn't move forward. It didn't need to. The gang felt the loss like a physical weight. They were standing in the same place as before, but it was no longer theirs. The ground did not support them the same way. The block had withdrawn consent, and consent is the quiet foundation of control. Bumpy did not chase them when they retreated. He let them go. That choice mattered more than pursuit ever could. It told Harlem something powerful. This was not about dominance. It was about correction. The street exhaled slowly as the gang disappeared down the block, their noise fading into something smaller, something unsure. People didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply resumed movement with a new understanding stitched into their steps. Bumpy walked home again as night settled fully. His sister was awake this time. She looked at him and saw something she hadn't seen before, not relief, not pride, but certainty, the kind that doesn't need explanation. She had been humiliated in public, but she had not been erased, and neither had Harlem. That night did not end with revenge. It ended with restoration, with the quiet return of dignity to a place that had been told too many times it did not deserve any. But Bumpy knew something the street did not yet understand. This was not the end. Men like the gang did not accept lessons easily. They carried shame differently. They would respond again, not loudly, not immediately, but dangerously. And when they did, the answer would no longer be symbolic. It would be permanent. By morning, one final decision would be made, not by the gang, but by Harlem itself, and it would determine whether those men ever walked that block again. The night ended quietly, but Harlem did not sleep. They returned separately now, not as a group, not laughing, not loud. Each man tested the block alone, hoping the tension had faded with the night. It hadn't. The street didn't react the way it used to. Doors stayed closed a second longer. Faces did not soften. Conversations paused when they passed, not out of fear, but recognition. They were being identified, not named, not accused. Identified. That distinction matters, because once a neighborhood identifies you, your options disappear quietly. You are no longer anonymous. You are no longer just passing through. You are remembered. Bumpy watched from a distance, careful not to become the story. He understood something most men learn too late. If you make yourself the center of the response, the system comes for you. If you let the community carry it, the system hesitates. Harlem was carrying this now. The gang felt the consequences stacking, not all at once. In pieces. A job opportunity disappeared. A safe place to linger vanished. A friendly face stopped smiling. These weren't punishments the law could track. They were consequences built from refusal. Refusal to engage. Refusal to accommodate. Refusal to pretend nothing had happened. One of the men tried to push back. He raised his voice in a place that had once welcomed it. The reaction was immediate and devastating in its calm. People turned away. No argument. No challenge. Just withdrawal. Withdrawal is terrifying because it cannot be fought. Another tried to apologize awkwardly, hoping words could reverse what actions had set in motion. The apology landed nowhere. It didn't offend. It didn't comfort. It simply passed through the air and disappeared. Harlem wasn't waiting for remorse. It was enforcing memory. Bumpy returned home and sat with his sister as the city woke fully. She noticed the difference before he explained anything. The tension in her shoulders eased. The shame that had tried to settle into her skin found no place to stay. She wasn't being avoided. She wasn't being pitied. She was being protected in the most honest way possible by people who refused to let her pain become invisible. That protection mattered more than revenge ever could. By midday, the gang understood the reality they had created. They could still walk, still breathe, still exist, but they could not belong. And belonging is the one thing men like them depend on when fear stops working. One by one, they stopped coming back. No announcement, no confrontation, no victory speech, just absence. Harlem noticed and adjusted again, the way it always had to survive. The street returned to its rhythm, but the lesson stayed embedded. A lesson that would be remembered long after faces and names faded. That power does not always announce itself. That justice does not always wear a uniform. And that fear can be redirected when people stop feeding it. The gang never admitted defeat. They didn't have to. Their absence said enough. They learned what happens when humiliation is witnessed by a community that refuses to look away. They learned that some answers arrive without warning, and once they arrive, there is no arguing with them. Harlem didn't need to punish them publicly. It had already erased their presence. And Bumpy Johnson walked those same streets afterward with a quiet certainty that never left him, not because he had won a fight, but because he had learned how quickly a neighborhood can become a force when it decides, together, that enough is enough. That lesson would follow him for the rest of his life. And so would the memory of the night his sister was humiliated, and the hours that proved Harlem would never allow that silence again. They thought humiliating one woman would make Harlem smaller instead. It revealed how dangerous a united neighborhood could be when it decides to answer back.